Good evening. It is good to see a few visitors from area congregations here with us this evening. So glad that you're here. Encourage all of you to come back. We'll be having a gospel meeting next week. So if you get the opportunity to come back again next week or any of those times, we'd be more than happy to have you, and encourage you to bring some friends to that too. There's flyers in the back. So hope that you'll consider being with us, supporting us in that as well. But so glad that you're here today. We want to think this evening about a woman who had some pretty close access to Jesus. And want to look especially at the text in Luke chapter 10. So if you want to be turning over there with me in your scriptures, Luke chapter 10, I want to read to you about Martha and Mary. And today I want to focus specifically on Martha. It says in Luke chapter 10 and verse 38, "Now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she approached him and said, 'Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me.' And Jesus answered and said to her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her.'" There's only a few women in the Gospels that seem to gain close access to Jesus Christ during his earthly life. Obviously, a few of his apostles are by his side. We'd expect to see that. But perhaps more unexpectedly, we find in the Scriptures a trio of siblings from the small town of Bethany that are also sharing a close relationship with Jesus. This wasn't a one-sided admiration of the Messiah either. It's not just that Martha and Mary and Lazarus respected and loved Jesus. Jesus also loved them, the Scripture says. John shares this in John chapter 11 and verse 5. John says that now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And so this was a mutually affectionate and loving relationship and friendship that existed between these people. I want you to consider with me here this evening the description of Martha, one of the women that Jesus loved in the Scriptures. And just notice a few things we can learn about her and imitate from her as we try to live out the Christian faith in our lives today. I want you to notice, first of all, that Martha was a woman of hospitality. Now, Jesus seems to gently rebuke her, if not even slightly scold her, which, by the way, tells us something about Jesus and tells us something about love. Sometimes true love disciplines, chastens, rebukes, speaks up when it sees something that there's not quite right. And Jesus is doing that with Martha. And even though we see that with Jesus and we see that with Martha, and we see that there's maybe something that Martha needs to refine and improve in her character, there's also some very positive things about Martha that I want to focus on first before we start to look at that rebuke. And the first is this, that she was a woman of hospitality. Often in Scriptures, Martha is pictured as a woman who is girded with an apron. She's bustling with action as she's entertaining guests. And that's something that's not a knock on Martha. It's something that's very respectable about Martha. In Luke 10 and verse 38, who was it that welcomed Jesus into her house? It was Martha. It says, now Martha welcomed him into her house. Sometimes you come over to some people's houses and it's like, oh, great, you're here. And that wasn't Martha's attitude when it came to Jesus. Martha was excited and happy that Jesus was there and welcomes Jesus into her home. And we can admire a woman who opens her home to visiting guests so they can have a refreshing break from their travels. For some people, I think entertaining guests, it's too burdensome, it's too cumbersome a task. And yet, when we read the Scriptures, the service of hospitality is one way that we display that we are affectionate to one another with brotherly love. Look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. That's exactly what is enjoined upon the disciples there, that we should be affectionate to one another. Well, how do we do that? As you read further in the book of Romans, I think it gives you a few ways we can be affectionate. It says we can give preference to one another. We actually prefer one another's company. It's not like, man, if I was left on an island somewhere and I could only be with one person, would the church be last on my list? Would you prefer all of your friends from the world and everywhere else? And would Christians kind of be the lowest on the totem pole there? We're to prefer one another. We're to want to be in one another's company and enjoy being in one another's company. Not lagging in diligence, verse 11 says, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer. One of the things that I thought was so beautiful when Brother O'Keefe was here last week, he came to our home. The kids were so excited that he was coming. I've got to tell you a funny story. I do have to tell you this. Brother O'Keefe came, and he came to our home, and after he went to his room and I was tucking the girls into bed, Zoe looks up at me and says, Dad, you didn't tell me that he was black. She had no idea that he was a black man from Uganda. She was shocked at that, it seemed. But it was funny to listen to Brother O'Keefe's stories as well. He's not used to seeing a lot of white people around here as well. So it was a learning experience for him. He's never preached to an all pretty much primarily white church. That was different for him as well. But hey, we're brothers and sisters in the blood of Jesus Christ, and our skin color doesn't matter a bit. Back to the main point, which was this. When he came over, he took my daughter's hands, and we all held hands around the table, and he says, I want to lead a prayer. And he prayed, and he thanked God that God protected him. He prayed for our family. He prayed a blessing on our family for sharing our home with him. And it was so beautiful. It was a beautiful moment. It wasn't one of those prayers before you eat. It was just a spontaneous prayer. And it said a lot about his character and said a lot about the relationship that we share in the Lord. But that's what verse 12 is all about. We're continuing steadfastly in prayer. We show our affection and concern because we pray for each other. And we're willing to do that for one another. But verse 13 is where we start to get to Martha. We are distributing to the needs of the saints. One way we show we care is when the saints are in need, we try to do what we can to help them with those needs. And we are given to hospitality. The idea about that is that when it says given to hospitality, it's a natural thing. It is natural to be hospitable to one another. We are family. We are people who want others to share in this wonderful family, the family of God. And so we are more than willing to be welcoming and hospitable to people as we share our affection. And that's Martha. That's a good thing about Martha. While Jesus visits, Martha, we read in Luke 10 and verse 40, she's busy with much serving. She wants to be careful in her hospitality. It means a lot to her. Upon a later visit, John records this. If you look at John 12, you'll notice that this instance in Luke 10, it's not the only instance where Martha and her family were hospitable to Jesus. If you look at John chapter 12, you'll find another instance where hospitality is shown. It says in verse 1, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead. This is after the raising of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. And there they made him a supper. And Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Wouldn't that have been awesome? The Lazarus who had died, you had gone to his funeral. He is now back alive again, sitting and eating dinner with the family at the table. So it says something about her hospitality. Like the virtuous woman, Martha is a woman of order and action. When you read Proverbs 31, you read about that virtuous woman. That's a woman who is busy being hospitable and serving. If you want to be a virtuous woman, be a servant. Serve others. Be willing to feed others, to clothe others, like the virtuous woman did. Paul in the scriptures, he encourages women to manage the house and to be homemakers. And Martha, we could knock on Martha when we get to the latter part of Luke 10, but for all the negative things we could say about Martha, we need to focus on some positive things. and that is that she has an obvious grasp on this important quality. She cares for the home, and she's willing to be hospitable to others and serving them food. Hospitality, and I want to say this, it has an impact on people. It impacts people. We need to be careful that we don't ignore the fact that the growing Jerusalem church of Acts 2 was a hospitable church. You show me a church that is hospitable, and I'll show you a church that loves one another. When you're willing to be hospitable and open your homes to each other, it says something about your love for one another. You show me a church that never opens the door to another person, that often has a closed door where there is no relationship outside of the church building, and I'll show you a church that's dying. In Acts 2, the church was thriving and it was growing. It says in Acts 2 and verse 44, all who believed were together. They had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods. They divided them among all as anyone had need, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. Now, this doesn't mean it's the church's job to fund meals, to build cafes for the masses. I'm not talking about that. I think we jump to conclusions with the text when we go that far. They were doing this individually, house to house. It was an individual responsibility. Christians, the lesson we should learn from Acts 2 is Christians should be making time to be with each other, opening up their homes, visiting with one another, and feeling comfortable with one another. Visitors, part of hospitality is catering to visitors and strangers, but visitors should also be especially catered to. Feeding the visiting preacher, there's a reason why I'm mentioning this right now, because we still have a meal list with a couple of empty slots in the back. But feeding the visiting preacher or Christian should be a definite focus. We shouldn't be fighting over begging someone to feed the visiting preacher. We should be arguing over who gets the blessing of being able to do that. Do you see the difference? Difference is we realize that when we get to sit at the feet and share a meal with someone who has traveled miles to be here, who has years of preaching experience, who spent hours studying the Word, there is a definite blessing upon us by being able to just listen to that person talk and ask questions to that person for a few minutes. It's an awesome blessing and experience, and we should want to be able to share hospitality with people in those situations especially. I'm not sure that I need to say much more than what Jesus says about it. And so I'm just going to read to you what Jesus says about it in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25, it says this. Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. He will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He will set the sheep on his right hand, the goats will be on the left. Now, what's going to be the basis for judgment? It's going to be the basis for judgment here. Whether or not someone was a Calvinist or not a Calvinist, or whether, I do think that there's other scriptures that teach that that's important, but what did Jesus focus on here? Doctrinal issues? No, here is the basis for judgment here in this passage. The king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Why? Because I was hungry and you gave me food. And I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. And I was a stranger, visitor, and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. The righteous will answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or not properly clothed and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. When you care for the body of Christ, you care for Jesus Christ. himself. What's the basis and standard of judgment here? Well, friends, part of it is hospitality. Caring for people on an individual basis, loving them. And Martha was that. Martha was a woman of hospitality, and we can learn something from her hospitality. I want to notice a second thing with you about Martha, and that is that she was a woman of sentimentality. 4 days, remember, something significant happens to the brother of Martha and Mary. He dies. And you have to read the Gospel of John to read about the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11. But 4 days after the death of Martha's brother, Lazarus, Martha and Mary, they are joined by a few Jews who had come to comfort them concerning their brother. Come to comfort them concerning their brother. Sometimes I think we can be so consumed with business, with school, with work, that we have no time for the sentimental. And sometimes we need to make time for the sentimental things, for the emotional things, for things like grieving. Martha is here, even though she was a hard worker and she was busy and she liked to spend time in the kitchen and she loved to entertain. She's taken a break from that here. And I think we learn something from that. The writer of Ecclesiastes tells us this. If you read Ecclesiastes chapter 3, you read this beautiful passage. It says in verse 1, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, time to kill and a time to heal. There's a time to break down and a time to build up." Listen to verse 4. "There's a time to weep and a time to laugh." I'd like to think that Jesus had a lot of times of laughter in the home of Martha and Mary and Lazarus, but right now was not one of those times. It was a time of weeping. Lazarus had died. These people were sad, and these people needed to be comforted. Jews were there to comfort them. Martha's a little bit upset, actually, that it took Jesus so long to come to comfort them. Of course, Jesus had a reason for that. He wanted Lazarus to be good and dead before he raised him from the dead, so that miracle itself could have been extremely impressive, and it is impressive. But one of the things that we learn is that there is a time for sentimentality. There's a time for work. There's a time for, busting it out there on the job. But there's a time to take a break from your job and be with other people who need to be comforted too. As Jesus arrives, the grieving Martha says this in verse 21. She says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And this statement not only confesses a faith in the power of Jesus, but it's obvious she's grieving, she's hurt, and it's provoked by loss. Maybe a lesson we can learn then from this is that nobody's made of steel. There are some people, you get the impression from them that they've never shed a tear in their life, and you could never hurt their feelings. They are just tough as nails. They work all the time. They're busy. They just don't seem as emotional as others. Martha, I think, to me, when I picture Martha, maybe my idea is wrong, but Martha may be that type of woman who's always working. She's super organized. She's always serving. She's tough as nails. She's scheduled. She's hardworking, but she had a soft spot too. And we need to understand that about some people. That even the toughest people sometimes crack and they break and their hearts are broken and they grieve and they need comforted. Her brother was dead, and for a while she needed to take time off of serving and needed others to serve her. Sometimes those people that serve all the time, sometimes we need to realize when they're going through things, they need to be served a little bit too. And Martha needed that here. They need to be served by comforting, by encouraging, by strengthening her in her grief. It's okay to be sentimental. We can learn that, I think, from Martha. It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel sadness, to grieve, to take time off of our busy schedules. And Martha teaches us about how there's a time for it as we see her life portrayed in the Gospels. It's okay. It's okay to be emotional about some things. Scriptures, we read lots of occasions. We're going to read one pretty soon here where Aaron dies and the entire nation of Israel grieves for 30 days when Aaron dies and they lose their leader. That should tell us something. Our typical funeral is 3 to 4 days, and we expect people to be over it like that. We've still had the funeral. It's time to go back to work after 4 days. Look, people grieve a lot longer than that, and sometimes need longer than that to get over it, and they need to be comforted continually after those 3 or 4 or 5 days have passed by. And Martha needs that. A third thing I want you to see, is that she was a woman of propriety. Here's where I get that. She's a woman of propriety. Take a look at John chapter 11 and verse 17. John chapter 11 and verse 17. 4 days after Lazarus had died. What you read in John 11 is that's when Jesus arrives. Kind of an interesting scene because what you read in John 11 is that his disciples wanted him to hurry. He takes his time. And it says in verse 17, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. So as Jesus came to the tomb, he asked for the stone to be removed. You look at verse 39. He has a conversation with Martha and with Mary. And then in verse 39, Jesus comes to the tomb and he says, take away the stone. Now what happens to a body after it's been dead for 4 days without anointing spices out in the heat, not in a sealed coffin? It stinks, Joanne says. Yes, that's what happens. I don't think we have to experience that with a human body to know. You've experienced with animals, haven't you? After an animal's on the side of the road for 3 or 4 days, especially when it's 90 degrees outside, it stinks. It begins to bloat. It's kind of gross. So, verse 39, Jesus says, take away the stone. Martha, here's Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. I think that says something about her propriety. What does propriety mean? I think propriety is simply this. It's the idea that we have good manners, that we have etiquette, that we show good taste. That's what being a woman of propriety is. Women, did you know in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it talks about modest apparel. The old King James Version says that women should be shamefaced. The New King James Version says that women should be people of propriety and people of moderation. And the idea of propriety is that you show good taste. The idea is you dress appropriately for the occasion. You say the right words that are appropriate for the occasion. It's showing good manners. It's being polite. It's saying hello when someone passes by you. It's offering help to someone who's in need. It's smiling when the time is appropriate and learning not to smile when the time is not appropriate, or smirk or laugh. It's paying compliments. It's being polite. And I think that's the idea in telling Jesus, I don't know if I want to see Lazarus' dead body, and I certainly don't want to smell the stench. That's just going to overwhelm me with grief again when I have to think about my brother and I have to smell his dead body. I'm not sure if we want to do this. She's a woman of propriety. To Martha, the request of Jesus seems to be a little bit inappropriate, is the idea. The fond memories of her brother would be tainted by the sight and smell of his decaying body. And that thought indicates tact on the part of Martha that's worthy of emulation. You ever know somebody doesn't have tact? They're not tactful. Tact is encouraged in the Scriptures. It's being thoughtful, considering the occasion. Philippians chapter 2, this is what Paul teaches based upon the example of Jesus. And of course, we all know why Jesus was opening that tomb, right? He was going to heal Lazarus. It was all going to be better. It's not that Jesus wasn't being tactful. Jesus had a greater purpose that Martha didn't realize at that time. But Philippians 2 and verse 3 says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. And let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. The person of propriety does that. They consider the golden rule. How will this person feel if I say this or if I act in this manner? And that's what Martha's thinking about here. She had the ability to determine typically appropriate conduct for the situation at hand. But here's the last one, and here's the one that maybe you've heard lessons on before and points on before. And that is, even though Martha was a woman of sentimentality, she was hospitable, she was a woman of propriety, it would seem, had pretty good taste, she was guilty of misplaced priorities. And that tells us something about good people, doesn't it? That even good people can sometimes be wrong and sometimes have misplaced priorities. Luke 10 and verse 39. Here we see that Lazarus had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet, or that's actually Martha had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. You know the scene, right? I know some of you women on Thanksgiving Day, you know the scene, right? You're in the kitchen, you're cooking turkey, and you're whipping up sweet potatoes and mashed potatoes, and you're baking rolls, and you're pulling out stuff out of the fridge that you've made for the last 2 nights. You've been up all night long, and what is some of those men doing? Sitting in there watching football. You've been slaving away all night long, all morning long, and they're sitting there talking. And you're sitting there thinking, do you think maybe you could help? Right? So you can't really blame Martha because you've had that feeling before. The difference is this, is that Jesus was in Martha's home and now your husband, and they weren't watching football, they were talking God. That is a little different. So just remember this, husbands. If your wives begin to criticize you, just make sure that you're talking about something spiritual, because then they don't have the right to beckon you to come to the kitchen. Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Jesus, can't you fix this for me? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part which shall not be taken away from her. As we see here, there's a simple principle, and that is, even though it's good to be hospitable, and it's good to serve others, we see that in scriptures, sometimes there can be something greater and something better. We ought not to be so consumed with good things, we fail to realize there might be greater things that Jesus may be calling us to do. Now I want you to think about that principle, and I want you to really apply it, because I think we need to apply it. There are a lot of good things that a lot of good people here do. And there's nothing in and of themselves that are necessarily wrong or sinful. I think it is, I love sports, obviously. I coach soccer and softball, and they've been asking me to coach the 5th grade basketball team, and I'm trying really hard to say no. But I love coaching sports. It's fun. And I love watching my kids because they're only going to be young once. And I just think it's to me, they're growing up so fast, and this is the best time in their life. They're young and they're running around, and I love it. I love watching your kids play sports too. I think that's fun. I wish my kids weren't playing every night so I could go watch some of you other kids play sports more. But it's fun. But when sports causes me or my children to habitually miss out on my edification from the church, then maybe sports beginning to play too big a role in my life. My daughter had a game Wednesday night, and I've told the coaches already, I've already told them, you got a game, don't schedule it at these times. We will work around every other time, but if it's at these times, it's just going to be nearly impossible to do it. Scheduled a game. It was a friendly. It didn't actually count for really anything. But it was at Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Told the coach, we have Bible study Wednesday at 7 o'clock. You've known that for 3 years. 3 years. She's not going to be there because we have Bible study. I want my kid to play sports. I want her to enjoy that. I want her to be a good teammate and a good coworker. I want her to respect her coach. But coach is never going to be more important than God. Responsibility to God is going to come before coach. Responsibility. My son, he loves singing, loves choir, plays piano. He's already in that 6th grade class. The teacher's already got him up there playing notes for the whole class. And so that she doesn't have to sit at the piano, she can conduct the choir. He plays the notes on the piano. It's already kissing up to the teacher. I'm so proud of it. 4 performances this year, 2 of them Wednesday nights, 7 o'clock. Wrote the teacher, I love you. We love choir. I was in choir. I love to sing. My son loves to sing. I'm all about supporting your choral program, but Ann, can you please, just in the future, I know you can't change things now, but just in the future, think about not scheduling at these times out of respect for religious convictions. And if not, can he do another assignment? Because he's probably going to flunk choir, which is pretty sad because he's worked at music for a long time. But choir teacher, you're never going to be more important than God. I'm all about volunteering. I think it's great when kids volunteer at hospitals. We've got some kids that volunteer at hospitals and nursing homes, but we've got kids that are skipping out on church services so they can go volunteer at hospitals and nursing homes. And when that happens, I think your volunteerism, just so you can put a little note that some college counselor is going to skip right over really quick, just so that you can put that on your resume or on your college application. I think when you're too busy doing those things to give yourself entirely to the assemblies of the church, then maybe you are neglecting a better thing for a good thing. Does that make sense? I'm all for working and making money. Support your family. Shame on you if you're not supporting your family. You should be supporting your family. And I'm all for sharing that money with other people. But when your work takes you away from the church on a habitual basis, then you need to start thinking about what you can do to change that. I'm all for folks fishing. I'm all for you enjoying nature walks and taking vacations, but when recreational hobbies take people consistently away from the church and we're choosing those things over the better things of learning and sitting at the feet of Jesus, then I think we've got a Martha problem. I'm all for using cell phones to help communicate. I love texting. It's quick, it's easy. I love shopping online. I'm a shopaholic online. I hate going to stores now. It's awesome that you can just scroll, you pay, boom, they send it to your door. That's awesome. I love being able to check my email wherever I'm at. I can work wherever I'm at. Do y'all know that? I'm sitting getting my oil changed for an hour and I'm responding to emails that people have sent me. I'm getting work done doing oil changes. So I love it. But when I decide to ignore what the preacher is saying in favor of texting, shopping, or checking my email, then maybe that's an impropriety. I'll tell you another story that Francis told me in Uganda, and then my dad was telling me. They have men, they don't have cell phones really out in the middle of Uganda. These are extremely poor people, but they have men who walk up and down the rows. This is what the deacons do. This is their assignment in the church. And if children aren't paying attention, they whip them. In the middle of services, he said, my dad was telling me when he preached in Nigeria, he said, I preached to 700 people. 700 people, and you could hear a pin drop. You know why? Because the deacons walked up and down the rows, and there were little small babies and children, and those children are in order. Why? Because they don't spare the rod. They discipline. we need to respect the preaching of the word. That's, I think, what Jesus is getting across to Martha. Hey, I'm all about your hospitality. I'm all about those things, but this right now is the most important thing. I went and heard Wilson Adams. Some of you know Wilson Adams. But I went and heard Wilson Adams when he was over at Mary, and he preached on this exact same text from Luke chapter 10. I want to tell you the illustration he gave when he preached on it. He was illustrating this text. He said, you know what? I went to a young couple's house. Nice young couple. They had me over. I was there for the whole week at the gospel meeting. He said, but let me tell you what happened every night after that gospel meeting. You know, I'm there by myself. There's no family there. I just need somebody to talk to every once in a while. I'd get done preaching. I'd come downstairs. The television was on. I would sit down on the couch between this lovely couple, and one of them was on their cell phone here, and one of them was on their cell phone here. They would scroll. You'd hear them laugh to themselves every once in a while, you know, when they read a funny joke. They'd be texting. They'd be Facebooking. He said eventually, so every night I'd go down there and say, well, I just sit there. And they wouldn't talk to me. They would just be watching their TV and sitting there scrolling. And so every night I would just say, well, good night. And I would just mosey off on to bed. Man, that's our culture. That's messed up. That's messed up. Nice people. But listen, you got a preacher who's been preaching for like 30 years in your house. He knows the word forwards and backwards. There are so many questions you could ask him, so much knowledge you could tap into, so many years of experience you could be learning from him, and you're looking at the idiotic things that people are putting on Facebook. That's what's wrong with America, y'all. We're getting our knowledge from Facebook and Instagram. And that's why we're raising a generation of fools. I'm going to get up on my soapbox in just a minute here. We're ignorant people who think we're smart because of our technology. And we're missing out on huge opportunities to be learning from well-educated, smart, intelligent people because we're addicted to our technology. Do you think that we could just as easily say here that Martha was busy Facebooking and doing other things, and Mary was the one sitting at the feet of Jesus, and this could just as easily be Jesus rebuking her for being too concerned with technology and her computer and her phone and not taking the time to learn from Jesus? And I'm not speaking on phone people. Well, you got people who skip church for Super Bowls, who are skipping church to go watch the Oscars, to go to brainless, mindless, spiritually unfruitful, unfilling things like that. And we wonder what's happening to our generation. We need to get our priorities turned around. America, the church in America, is headed in a bad direction. A lot of it has to do with decent people who are more concerned with being valedictorians and scholarship athletes and business professionals and making all kinds of sacrifices so they can one day have health and wealth, and they're not making enough sacrifices to become spiritually fruitful. We need more Christians willing to put down the TV remote, the cell phone, the rake, the measuring cups, and all the other stuff that's getting in their way, and pick up their Bibles and come sit at the feet of Jesus. What are some things we can learn from Martha? She was hospitable. We need to imitate that. She was sentimental, and it's okay to be sentimental. She was a woman of propriety. She had tact. She knew when to do the right things and to say the right things. Yet, she was wrong. Could this be you? Jesus, in the parable of the vine, the branches, he says, here's what happens. Two different things. Some people get cut off the vine completely. That's when you won't listen to instruction anymore. But for other people, Jesus prunes them to make them more fruitful. This is a lesson that's totally intended to do just that. Maybe you're a good person, you do a lot of good things. Jesus would be proud of you in a lot of ways, but could you become more fruitful by dedicating more time to the study of His Word, to prayer, to the assemblies of God's people, and making that a priority? Are there other things getting in the way of what you could be doing that are choking out the Word and making you less fruitful? If that's you, then you need to think about that, and I call you to action in your own life. Change those things in your own life. If you're not a Christian, you need to start on that walk with God, becoming His servant, because the Lord needs you. He needs your work. He needs you living for Him, being that bright, shining light that Martha was in so many ways. He needs you doing that as well. If you're subject to invitation in any way, we encourage you. Why don't you come while we stand and while we sing.